When did you realize you were being lied to? The first thing I noticed was that she started coming home not empty-handed, not with bags or purchases, but with the feeling that her day had continued somewhere else. We had been living together for almost a year. Everything was routine by then. Routes, dinners, conversations on autopilot. That's why even the smallest shifts felt painfully noticeable. She started texting on her way home. Before, she used that time to listen to music or stare out the window. Now her screen kept lighting up, and her fingers moved too fast, as if she was afraid of not finishing a conversation in time. One evening, we were having dinner in the kitchen. Her phone was lying on the table face up. It vibrated, and I managed to catch part of the message before she quickly turned it over. The message started with the word, "Did you get there?" Short, ordinary, without emotion. The kind of message you send only to someone you care about. It wasn't work-related, and it definitely wasn't for me. I didn't ask anything. I finished eating, washed the dishes, went to bed next to her, listening to how easily and calmly she fell asleep. The kind of sleep people have when there's no internal argument left inside them. The next day, she was late by almost 2 hours. She texted that she'd be staying late because of work. The message was sent calmly, without explanations. A few minutes later, I accidentally saw her friend's story on social media. A bar, dim lights, laughter. She was there, wearing the same clothes she had left the house in that morning. When she came home, there was no tension in her, no caution. She behaved as if nothing between us had shifted. The conflict didn't happen because of the story or the time. It happened because the truth had started piling up and no longer fit into small details. A few days later, her phone was left on the table again when she went to the bathroom. A notification appeared almost immediately. This one was longer. It said that she was missed, that the time together hadn't been enough, and that there was a desire to repeat it soon. I read everything, not out of curiosity, but out of the need to finally stop guessing. When she came back, I didn't make a scene. I didn't raise my voice. I simply made it clear that I knew. At first, she downplayed the seriousness of what was happening. Then she explained it away as exhaustion, a difficult period, an attempt to figure herself out. At some point, the responsibility shifted entirely onto me, for the tension, for the questions, for the lack of trust. We didn't break up that evening, but from that moment on, I lived with the feeling that truth had to be dug out instead of given freely. A month later, I realized I had stopped asking questions. Not because everything was clear, but because the answers no longer changed anything. My friend had a girlfriend he said he could finally breathe with. They didn't live together, but they saw each other almost every day, made plans, talked about vacations, discussed moving in together. From the outside, everything looked calm. No drama, no constant fights. The first unsettling things didn't show up in their relationship, but in conversations with us. He started getting mixed up. Sometimes he'd say she stayed over, then later say he was alone that night. He corrected himself quickly, as if he noticed the inconsistencies only after the words were already out. He blamed it on being tired. Then there were her new responsibilities. She began disappearing more often in the evenings, explaining it with courses, projects, work meetings. The names changed, but the pattern didn't. She was unavailable exactly during the hours she used to be reachable. One day, he happened to be near the place where she claimed she'd be. Not out of suspicion, it was a coincidence. He walked in and didn't see her. He assumed he'd mixed up the timing. A few days later, he saw a notification when she stepped away. The message was short and very specific. It asked whether everything was still on for that night, and added that last night had been too noticeable. He didn't read any further. He said those words were enough. The confrontation came later. Not immediately. When he carefully tried to clarify what was going on, everything turned upside down. He was accused of being paranoid, of looking for problems, of needing to trust more. She denied specific facts, but never offered anything concrete in return. Every response slipped into vague phrasing and avoidance of direct answers. A couple of weeks later, he saw her with another man. Not at night, not in secret, in broad daylight, in a cafe. They were sitting across from each other, holding hands. When she noticed him, there was no panic, no attempt to explain, just irritation, as if she hadn't been caught lying, but merely inconvenienced. Later she texted that he'd misunderstood everything, that it wasn't so clear-cut, that his lack of trust had ruined the relationship. He didn't reply, not because there was nothing to say, but because at that point it was obvious. When someone is willing to build multiple realities at the same time, the truth stops matching. My ex lied to me for almost a year. Not every day, not about everything. And that's exactly why it took so long to see it as one complete picture. In the beginning, she seemed like someone you could trust without conditions. Calm, consistent, always ready with explanations. She never avoided questions, but she answered them in a way that made you feel uncomfortable asking more. She talked about honesty a lot, too often, as if she was setting the rules in advance. We moved in together quickly, not out of passion, but because it felt practical. And at first, it really worked. Shared routines, morning coffee, familiar evenings. Everything looked stable. Then she started visiting her parents more often. At first, it was rare. Then it became regular. Sometimes for a day, sometimes for two. She said they needed help, that things were complicated, that she had to be there. I didn't question it. Not because I was naive. There was simply no obvious reason not to believe her. Over time, I noticed that those trips never lined up with anything specific. Not holidays, not emergencies. They appeared like pauses, whenever our relationship felt too close or required a decision. Every time she came back, she seemed calm, too collected, like someone who had reset in a place where no one asked questions. We talked about the future, about money, about where we'd be in a few years. She stayed in the conversation, but never took a real step forward. Formally present, emotionally suspended. I told myself it was just her personality. Months passed, and her stories started to repeat. Not word for word, structurally. The same logic, the same explanations. Even when the situations were different, the shape of the story stayed identical. Sometimes she forgot what she had said before. Not confused, forgotten, and corrected herself instantly, without hesitation, like editing a script in her head. We still didn't fight. That was the strangest part. The first real conflict happened when I said I felt distance. Not an accusation, just an observation. She agreed, calmly, said it wasn't the best time, but that things would become clearer soon. Suggested we wait. More months passed. I began to feel like a guest in my own life. Someone who was informed, but never included. Important things were happening somewhere close, just not with me. The turning point came unexpectedly. I ended up in a casual conversation with someone she knew. No suspicion, no intent, just small talk about work and travel. At some point, the person casually mentioned that my ex had been living between two cities for almost a year. Said it like it was common knowledge. That she had a rented apartment there. That she'd been settled for a long time. That it was simply more convenient for her that way. It took me a moment to understand what I was hearing. Because according to everything I knew, her parents lived in a completely different direction. In a different city. One that didn't match the distance, the timing, or the exhaustion she always described. That single fact didn't fit any part of her story. Not the dates. Not the routes. Not the overnight stays. Not the explanations. When I asked her about it directly, she didn't deny it. She didn't apologize. She didn't try to twist the story. She said she had another life there. Not an affair, a choice. Another job. Other people. Another rhythm. And I was the part she didn't want to lose while she decided where she wanted to end up. That was when it became clear. She wasn't lying because she was afraid of the truth. She was lying because she was choosing and keeping me on hold. We broke up without shouting, without scenes. But that was the moment I understood that the longest lies aren't the ones you hide. They're the ones where you keep someone waiting. We were renting an apartment together. At least, that's what I believed. It was one of our first adult decisions, to move in and split the expenses. The place was nice, bright, in a good neighborhood, nothing fancy. She said she found it through acquaintances, no agents involved, and that the owner was easy to deal with. That was enough for me. We agreed right away that I'd transfer my share to her every month, and she'd handle the rest. It seemed simpler that way. I didn't question the details. It felt normal for one person to take care of logistics. The first few months, I was even proud. We weren't just dating anymore. We were living together. Shared routines. A shared fridge. Shared payments. I contributed without hesitation. Sometimes she joked that I was the perfect roommate. Back then, it sounded harmless. Over time, small things started to feel off. She spoke about the apartment with too much confidence. Not like someone staying temporarily, but like someone who owned every wall. She'd say things like, "I'm not changing that. Not we, but I." I ignored it. Once, the faucet broke. I suggested calling a plumber. She said it wasn't worth fixing right now, that it could wait, as if the decision wasn't really ours. Then there were the neighbors. They greeted her like she belonged there, not like a renter. I caught myself feeling like the temporary one. Still, I didn't connect the dots. The truth came out in the most ordinary way. Not during a fight, not in a confrontation, in a casual conversation with someone who had nothing to do with us. I was dealing with paperwork at work and ended up chatting with a woman who lived in our building. I mentioned that I was renting an apartment with my girlfriend. She nodded and calmly corrected me, said the apartment had been registered in my girlfriend's name for years, long before we met. For a moment, I felt nothing, just emptiness. Then a sharp, freezing shock. I remember stepping outside and just standing there, staring at nothing. One thought kept looping in my head. Oh my God, it was her apartment the whole time. All the transfers, all the splitting rent, all the conversations about expenses. It turned out I wasn't renting anything. I was paying her. Every month. Consistently. Like a paycheck. When I came home, I wasn't pretending to be calm anymore. I wasn't yelling, but inside I was falling apart. She didn't deny it right away. First, she said she didn't see a problem. Then she said it was more convenient that way. Then she said I would have paid for housing anyway. So technically the money was staying in the family. In the family. That's when it really hit me. Not anger, disgust. The feeling that all this time I hadn't been living with a partner, but with someone who turned our relationship into a source of income. I looked at her and thought, how could I live with someone who lied this calmly, every single day? I moved out that same evening. Took only the essentials. A week later, she wrote that I was overreacting. That money was a small thing. That feelings mattered more. But after that, I understood one thing. If someone can monetize intimacy that coldly, then feelings stopped mattering a long time ago. I didn't lose my relationship first. I lost my reputation. It started with small changes I couldn't explain. Friends stopped inviting me like before. Conversations felt shorter. People listened to me with caution, like they were waiting for something unpleasant. I thought I was imagining it. She, on the other hand, became softer around others. More vulnerable. Always tired. Always holding on. At home, she talked about how hard it was for her emotionally. How she felt unsafe sometimes. How she needed reassurance. I believed her. I made myself smaller to make room for her pain. I didn't know she was preparing a version of events where I was the threat. It came apart all at once. A mutual friend sat me down and asked, very carefully, if everything was okay between us. Not in a curious way. In the way people speak when they already believe something bad might be true. I asked what they meant. They told me she had been opening up. Quietly. Over time. Saying she felt controlled. Watched. Pressured. That she stayed because she was afraid of how I'd react if she left. I felt physically sick. None of it had ever been said to me. Not once. No complaints. No fear. No warnings. I realized she had been documenting our relationship in reverse, collecting moments, twisting them, retelling them with different meanings. Normal disagreements became intimidation. Silence became emotional punishment. Concern became control. She wasn't lying impulsively. She was building a case. When I finally confronted the situation, I didn't argue facts. I listened. And that's when I understood the most terrifying part. She truly believed her own story. Or at least performed it well enough that others did. By the time I left, the narrative was already locked in. I wasn't the guy who walked away. I was the guy she escaped. I didn't lose her. I lost the room. The benefit of the doubt. The right to be neutral. That's when it hit me. The most brutal lies aren't told to your face. They're told for you. So that when the truth finally arrives, no one is waiting to hear it. For a long time, I thought the problem was me. She often said I was too sharp. That I lacked tact. That I didn't know how to talk to people. Especially her friends. Especially her circle. I tried to change. Watch my words. Joked less. Stayed quiet more. I believed that if I softened myself, things between us would get easier. At the same time, she kept telling me how I looked from the outside. Never directly, always casually. That people found me difficult. That I could be unpleasant. That she had to smooth things over because of me. I felt guilty even when I didn't understand why. Over time, I noticed that around her I was constantly doubting myself. My reactions. My emotions. I replayed normal conversations in my head, wondering if I had said something wrong. She always stayed calm. Confident. Like someone who knew exactly where the truth was. The shift happened at a group gathering. No scandal. No scene. Just a long evening where, for the first time, we were physically apart most of the night. I listened to how people talked to me, laughed with me, disagreed with me normally. No tension, no irritation. Then I accidentally stood near a group talking about her. Not about me, about her. Someone mentioned that she complained a lot, that things were hard for her, that she lived with someone who suppressed her, that she had to be careful not to provoke me. I stood there, silent. And with every sentence, something inside me collapsed. It wasn't one conversation. It wasn't one person. It was a version of me she had been telling others. Calmly, consistently, convincingly. I understood that, to everyone else, I had already become the problem. The source of tension. The person she needed protection from. When we got home, I felt empty. Not angry. Not ready to fight. Just burned out. I started replaying everything. Her talks about what people think, about how I should be grateful she stayed with me. That's when it clicked. This wasn't care. It was image building. She hadn't been lying to me directly. She had been lying about me. For years. I didn't argue. Didn't defend myself. Because you can't win against a story already told for you. I just left. And the hardest part wasn't the breakup. It was realizing I had lived next to someone who built her safety by slowly destroying who I was in the eyes of others. What connected us wasn't just feelings. It was money. The idea to start something together came about a year into the relationship. Nothing flashy, a small service-based business. It was her idea, but the startup money was mine. She talked about independence, about building something as a team. I believed her. I invested more in the beginning. Not because she asked, it just made sense. She handled operations, I handled finances. On the surface, it looked balanced. The first few months went fine. Clients appeared, there was some income, busy weeks. She often said she was exhausted, that running everything was harder than she expected. She started staying late at the office, sometimes overnight. Said it was easier than commuting back and forth. I didn't argue, the logic sounded reasonable. But over time, I noticed something strange. She came home calm. Not the kind of tired you get from working too much. The calm of someone who had everything under control. Sometimes the numbers didn't add up. Not dramatically, just enough to make you uneasy. Income slightly lower, expenses slightly higher. She always had explanations. Taxes, equipment, one-time costs. I accepted them. At some point, she suggested postponing my share of the profits for now. Said it would help the business grow faster. Said she was thinking long-term. I agreed. The breaking point didn't happen in the office or over documents. It happened by accident. I ran into someone who knew her professionally. Not from our business, from another one. During a casual conversation, they mentioned her as a co-owner of a similar operation. Same industry, different name. I didn't react. I just listened. According to them, she had been working there for over a year. Not as a consultant, as a manager. Signing contracts. Getting paid well. A year. That meant the late nights weren't always about our business. The exhaustion had a second source. And the financial gaps finally took shape. When I brought it up, she wasn't surprised. She didn't panic. She was irritated, like I had uncovered something inconvenient. She called it diversification. Said she didn't think it was important to mention. Said it was temporary. Said she planned to choose eventually. What she didn't deny was this. She used our business to cover gaps in the other one. Some expenses overlapped. My money quietly supported both projects. She said it wasn't betrayal. She called it strategy. That night, I went through the documents without her summaries for the first time. The picture was clear enough to keep me awake. I wasn't a partner. I was a buffer. We didn't yell. We didn't fight. I legally closed my part of the business. Took the losses. Signed the papers. Walked away. Later, she accused me of being emotional. Said I didn't understand how things work. Said I destroyed something that could have become big. But the truth was simpler. She didn't lie to protect something fragile. She lied to live in two realities at once. And expected me to finance the pause while she decided which one to keep.